thanks very much for doing this, because obviously from your perspective, thinking back over 25 years is a good span of time, and an interesting one in terms of all the things that you've done during the 25 years, but it's still an arbitrary span of time. You know, when you look back and you think that I'm about to ask you, what has changed in that 25 years? It isn't, it's not really, we know this is a little bit arbitrary, but nonetheless, that's the kind of starting premise for our conversation. We'll get into much more interesting stuff. But talking to Johan Rockström, you know, it was easy because he could just go straight into how much the science has changed.
Yes.
5 years, which was really important. And I'd sort of underestimated the degree to which so much else is dependent on that. But if I ask you the same question, where would you go as your sort of big things over the last quarter century?
I think we're in a really interesting period where we're sort of encountering a deglobalization period. COVID being a big driver of that, but not the only one. Technologies are contributing. And if I go back to the end of the last century, you know, the late 90s, that was a period of very intensive globalization. Absolutely. It was a period after the collapse of communism, where capitalism was on a roll, thought that the future was entirely its own to own and control and so on. And then you had the WTO protests and so on. So it was a period where capitalism was certainly still contested, but felt that, you know, globalization was the future. And now we're in a period where the sort of geopolitical and macroeconomic orders I think we've all got used to and grown up with to a considerable degree are all wobbling. They're all sort of showing very serious signs of coming apart, including even in our own country, the United Kingdom, you know, sort of the rule of law. You know, so is this just simply a temporary glitch, or is it, as I believe, yet another symptom that we're going through a U-bend in our collective history, where an old order decomposes, and much faster than we might have imagined, and some other orders start to self-assemble, and where the challenge for people like us is very different from simply advising individual companies and individual government departments or whatever it might be to, you know, tweak the system, but actually it's the systems that starts to break up around us. And now what are we now trying to build? And I find that both exciting and terrifying, probably in equal measure.
Yes, I think that is true. Is there a point in the intervening 25 years where the globalization momentum began to slow? Was it the financial crisis in 2008? Was it only sort of brought home to us all with COVID? If you had to show that curve of full-on globalization to where we are now, with a kind of deglobalization, as it were, are there moments in that history?
Well, no question, but that COVID-19 has been the sort of the influence that has brought all of this into clear view for a growing number of people. But I think it had been building for a while. I think people with extended supply chains, for example, into China, had become a little bit agitated about what was happening in that world. And I was talking, for example, to a major firm of lawyers earlier on today who set up in Hong Kong and Beijing and so on a long time ago, but they're really looking askance at some of the things that are happening in that part of the world. So I think this has been building for quite some time, but then also, and you know, we all know the hype cycle, we all know technology champions promise things by next Tuesday when they probably won't even come this decade, but you know, things like 3D printing do have longer term consequences for where the things that we use are made. So, but you're right. I think the pandemic has been the moment just where people have woken up and thought, oh, this isn't working terribly well. And then, you know, bare shelves and all the rest of it. It's not just in the UK. You've got these shipping crises everywhere now.
But we did say, and I said, I suspect you probably did as well, but I shouldn't make that claim. We did say after the financial crash, we did say that brings that part of this phase of capitalism to an end. We can't possibly go back to what it was like before that. And yet, unerringly, we did go back to it, more or less. I mean, some things definitely did not go back to where they were before, but the powers that be made such a concerted effort to take us back to some of those false securities. The feeling of, have we really learned anything at all, was very powerful.
Well, I think there was a pernicious effect of the, in effect, bailout of the financial institutions, apart from Lehman Brothers and so on, but where people felt we can take sort of idiotic risks, and at some point the government will wade in and save us. And I think over time that was strongly counterproductive. I do think, though, that even though the captains of industry, as we once would have called them, the people who run the big sort of organs of capitalism, were unsettled by that. And to some degree they did sort of try and claw things back to the way they were previously. But I think for young people, that was a moment, and this is another pernicious effect of 2007-9, where younger people just felt betrayed by the system. They didn't feel that they could trust politicians in bed with capitalism, all the rest of it. And I think that hasn't gone away, and maybe that will be the sort of almost the springboard for the next round of change, or it could undermine our attempts, because people just may say, it's not worth trying. I mean, this is a corrupt system and it's dying. I don't know which way that's going to go. I happen to be an optimist. I happen to think we can make this work. Still.
So I love this word decomposition. I'm fascinated to see it in those terms, that bits of the system are just sort of falling apart or putrefying in front of our eyes.
I believe they are.
And how do you track that? How do you sort of get a sense in the U curve where we are at any one point in those changes? Are you able to measure that, or just is it a more generic kind of sense that this is just, what the current reality looks and feels like?
Well, the simple answer is no, we can't exactly measure any of this. It's not like Johan's sort of focus on science. There isn't science to this. But I think you and I are both in very privileged positions where we talk to a lot of people inside the existing economic and political order, but we also talk to a lot of people to some degree still outside those orders. And so to some degree, I would say some of this is intuition. It's based on a study of history, which is always my favorite subject at school. And it's a sense that there are cycles, there are rhythms to what we do as human beings. And sometimes you can get the call wrong, but sometimes you can get it right. And in terms of evidence, I listen to what people are saying in boardrooms and C-suites in different parts of the world. And so, for example, 3 days ago, I was sort of deep into Nokia. Yesterday, I was deep into EQT, the sort of private equity group. This morning, I was deep into Slaughter and May, but also Catalonia and Barcelona. And
right.
Where we're doing a big event next month. And then I read the newspapers, and I'm more reading those sorts of things than otherwise. But for example, in today's Financial Times, you probably saw it, but there is this 40-page piece on the legal profession. And it's 20 pages are on sustainability, ESG, inclusivity, diversity, all of that sort of stuff. And our client isn't even in the top 30. And I'm going into their board meeting with them next week. And that's actually helpful. But it is intuitive. It is a sense that there is something deeply broken in the current system. And therefore, it's only a matter of time before, as we were just agreeing, it decomposes in front of our eyes. And then the real question is just, is that a catastrophe in the sense that the sort of political and social repercussions just drive us completely off the road? And I think, populism is to some degree rooted in the sense that people have that they can't trust governments to do the right thing, and we're moving into an increasingly unstable future. But it's also, as I said earlier on, I find it immensely interesting then to focus on the work of people like Rethink X, looking at sort of transportation, mobility, cattle ranching and dairying, energy, finance, disruptive technologies, disruptive business models. And again, you can't predict where that will take us. And very often, like with AI, artificial intelligence, we're seeing the whole sort of facial surveillance sort of thing coming up as a major issue. There will be lots of other things like that that spray out from this sort of reordering in our economy. But I'm just increasingly confident, insofar as you can be confident, that we're at one of those extraordinary moments where change really accelerates. And the question now is whether we're all up to it as people who profess to be interested in change and trying to drive this. Can we really steer this in the right directions, or even shape the process? I think we can, oddly. And I think there is, just finally, one of the big trends, I think, that has built relatively sharply in recent years, and you saw it in the 60s, and I was seeing it again, which is this sort of fragmenting of the generational compact, if it ever existed, but this sense that older people will do the best for younger people, and sort of vice versa. And when you look at pension provision, you look at employment and where the center of gravity in the global economy now sits, increasing in Asia, you look at people paying for their education, all of this different stuff. And then you look at the climate emergency stacked on top of that. I think there is a very, very real and growing risk that younger people will not just protest, not just go out in the streets, because with a corrupted political order, that doesn't mean much. I did it several times for Brexit. Where did that get us? So I think when I think about that intergenerational tension, I think that is in the process of becoming more aggravated. And I think it just one of the things I see people of my age, I'm 72, saying they're going to retirement. I'm not. They're saying, and now we'll hand over to the younger people to sort this out. We tried and we failed. I think that is so dangerous. I think we've really got to work out a pan-generational compact or whatever, and work really intensively together and over protracted timescales, which, as we all know, politics is not very good at doing. You know better than I.
Yes, I've probably wasted slightly more time in that space than you have, John, but it's relative. Just, I want to come back to that intergenerational thing, because I think it's so crucial, but I just want to go back to triple bottom line kind of evolution, because obviously when we set the forum up in 1996, we were the beneficiaries of the emergence of the triple bottom line as a compelling big idea from 94 onwards, maybe just before that, but I think it was 94.
Yeah, it was.
And as soon as the forum emerged, we could start talking to our very new and nervous partners about sustainability through the lens of the triple bottom line, and it worked really well. And that, as you know, then led to this sort of decades worth of elaboration around the business case for sustainable development, a bottom line based approach to
multiple forms of capital too,
and multiple forms of capital, and so on and so forth. It was great. I mean, there was a lot of real intellectual commitment to make a framework properly coherent and operational for companies, and working one's way through that business case with all the different elements behind it, how many ways in which they would benefit from getting good at all of this, was incredibly powerful. And the forum was definitely able to use all of that to good effect. So for me, just now that you are in the business of urging people to recall the triple bottom line and not to use it anymore, and I've even heard you on occasions get a tiny bit grumpy with people who are still, as it were,
grumpy, me?
No, yep, you. basing their thinking on pretty primitive triple bottom line type stuff. Just give me your sense of that 1994 to the recall moment, which must have been quite big and symbolic and emotionally quite engaging for you 2 years ago.
You might think so, but in a way it was intuitive again. And I happen to believe that our minds work at different levels, and intuition isn't always right. But for me, there are these moments where you just sense that something is not right and that something needs to be done. But when I came up with the original idea, it started off as the triple win sort of, that was sort of 93, 94. Then the triple bottom line hove in view, although weirdly it took me about 18 months to get to that formulation. And then it was out there. And then the following year, 95, I came up with the People, Planet, Profit, or even then Prosperity formulations. But I just thought, if you're trying to get into business, I think prosperity there sounds like either government's game, or it sounds like NGOs. Profit sounds, oh, well, maybe that is a bit like us. Maybe we should pay a little bit more attention. So that, as you said, it had an astounding impact for quite a period of time. So I do think that was useful. And if I compare it backwards to what was there before, BCSD or WBCSD as they became, they had eco-efficiency, and nothing wrong with that. But it was just simply the idea that you can save or make money by doing the right thing on energy, resources, pollution, or whatever. So when the triple bottom line came along and it said, it's not just the financial savings, and it's not just the direct environmental impacts that you have, but it's economic. So that's a bigger story. It's social. Whoops, that's going to be a problem if you're Walmart or whatever it happens to be. And then it's much bigger than your local footprint. This is the biosphere. This is life on Earth. So it was a slightly different framing. And just to be clear, I'm totally happy that the B Corporation movement, where you've got, I don't know, pushing 4,000 B Corps now that have chartered themselves around and are being audited against the triple bottom line. I mean, I'm totally happy with that, but contingent on one thing that I didn't understand when I did the recall. And, you know, I think Harvard Business Review were so excited to have somebody, this is the first time anyone in their history had ever recalled a brainchild or a management concept or whatever. And they actually put in the URL and then written in the title of the piece, no, this is why I'm giving up on it. Well, I wasn't giving up on it. Anyone who understands business, and I'd worked for companies like Ford and Toyota and so on, a product recall is not saying this particular vehicle or product is completely useless. It's saying there is a dysfunction, it's been called to our attention, and now we're going to correct it, and then we're going to put it back out into the market. And the way that I finally, and it took me again about 18 months to get there. And the most recent book, Green Swans, it was built around this recognition that the main problem has been a framing problem, at least in my mind. That people have seen the triple bottom line as about responsibility and accountability and stakeholder engagement, all that good stuff. But if you're in the responsibility frame, then in a sense, what you're doing is trying to ensure that everything you do is responsible. But that gets you into trade-offs very, very quickly, not into integrated solutions. And what we have now, and I just came up with the 3 Ps originally, people, planet, and profit, just stepped it up one notch in each case to 3 Rs. That was completely coincidental. But so to responsibility, resilience, and regeneration, and making the point that if you listened over the last 2 to 3 years to politicians, city mayors, CEOs, they're all talking resilience, because everything they're dealing with is wobbling. You know, their economies, their societies, their communities, their supply chains, their economies, what have you, and the biosphere in the midst of it all. And then the only thing that I was trying to say is that resilience is next, but you can't build back resilience into these systems without regenerating them, without working out what you want from them and investing in these systems, in their health and their well-being, and in their productivity, of course, over time. So that was the sort of extended story. And it was just, it was emotional when I saw how people reacted, because when the piece came out, a number of people were quite difficult and challenging and saying, how dare you? And, you know, we've only just got our brains around, we've only just got our board to think in this way. But most people said, yeah, we were using it, but had a sense that there was something that not quite right with it. And I was emotional about the impact that I'd had on people's realities without necessarily realizing that that's not what I was doing. Thoughtless, you might say.
So is the product now recalled and now revamped? Is the triple bottom line back out there again after the recall?
It never came, I mean, you can't recall.
No, but in your mind?
I think it's out there again. I think that the B Corporation movement, which is now being mimicked to some degree by much larger companies who are either acquiring B Corporations or themselves trying to see, would it be useful if we went through that sort of assessment? It's out there. I mean, I think it's, I also think that one of the things that happened when the triple bottom line first launched was that everyone and their donkey was suddenly sort of coming up with quadruple bottom lines and quintuple and, you know, wherever we go after that. And very often, though, they were picking things like governance or politics or education, which for me were actually in a central zone with these three forms of value created or destroyed around about. And when the multiple capitals thing came along, you know, I welcomed that as well. You know, whether it's 6 or 8. But I didn't know about you, and I suspect you're much better at numbers than I am. But I can remember 3 things. 10 commandments, I just screw up routinely. I just can't remember the whole list of things I'm not meant to be doing. So, I mean, it's out there again, never really came back. But I do think now, you know, when we set up Volans back in 2008, we were talking about 3 things. One was entrepreneurial solutions to big global challenges. And that sort of come through increasingly over time. But one of the elements we were talking about was system change. You've been talking about that for a very long time, but we put it on the agenda for the clients that we were working with. And at the time, I don't think they had a clue about what we were talking about. And now you find business leaders routinely talking about the need for system change. You have WBCSD with their reinvent, resilience, regeneration. So I think the ground is now shifting. Question, will it go far enough, and will it go in the right direction, and will it go fast enough? And I think a lot of that depends on the rest of us and on governments as well. God help us.
Yes, indeed. So just thinking on that, I suspect that the one area where you and I over the years have had less agreement than in most things, because mostly we're pretty aligned on this stuff, is the role of the consumer.
Yeah.
And the degree to which not just your very early kind of manifestation of these ideas through the different green consumer guides and various other things that you did early on, but you have stuck to a premise that the consumer is a critical part of the total change story, and that without factoring in the role of the consumer, it's quite difficult to factor in the role of companies, because companies, those who are addressing consumers, are very focused on that. Yeah. And I've been less enamored, as you know, of the potential of the consumer. After all of your sort of iterating around this notion of the role of the consumer, where are you now on that one?
Well, I well remember that in use of Friends of the Earth and you and so on, when we did the green consumer work, you were supportive, but always said that you felt the citizen angle was much more important. I absolutely agree, but I'm sort of I would say I've sometimes described myself as strategically opportunistic. So you know broadly the direction that you're trying to head in, and for me, the prime focus of much of what I've done since we founded Environmental Data Services back in 1978 was to try and break into the world of business, and then to influence how business thought about all this sort of stuff. And oddly, the green consumer idea came to me in 1986. I did a an exhibition at the Design Centre in London, and it was called the Green Designer. And we had everything, Rolls-Royce jet engines, we had spacesuits, we had all sorts of products that were designed with environmental performance in mind. And one of the people who came to that was Mike Flux. You may remember him, but he was ICI Group Environmental Advisor at the time. And he said, it's all very well for you sorts of people to feature our products. They had something called the Electrodyne sprayer. So it was a pesticide sprayer that put an electrostatic charge into the pesticide, which meant that all of the pesticide went onto the plant, not onto the soil or surrounding. Well, it's still pesticides. But when he said that, something clicked in my brain. And he said, consumers don't want this. And in the exhibition booklet that I put together, there were 10 questions that designers should ask themselves. And the last one would be, and this is the first time I'd ever used the phrase, would this appeal to the green consumer? And then we found various people, market research people, McCann Erickson, Mori, people beginning to detect this building wave. And I thought, well, could we take some of that energy and put it into the consumer's face? So as you'll remember, I mean, the Green Consumer Guide, I mean, it sold something like 1 million copies in 18 months. And it had a ferocious impact on the Unilevers and the Procter & Gambles and so on of this world, because this was an attack, a challenge, a set of questions from an angle that they weren't used to dealing with, because they were basically in business to serve the consumer. The consumer hadn't shown any great interest, boom. And I think that spike of interest lasted about 3 to 4 years, really intensively. And the NGOs managed it quite effectively, almost like retailers. They kept, doing the house leaders and shifting from one thing to another. But I suppose I was forced to recognize, or I came to recognize, that consumers are shock troops. You can mobilize them around, I'm sorry about the military metaphor, but you can mobilize them short periods of time, but you exhaust them very quickly if you require too much of them. So we played that game for as long as we could, and then more or less drop it. Do I now believe consumers aren't important? No, because I think whether it's paying more for the plastic bag or whatever it is in the supermarket, they are the pumping heart of our modern economy. And unless we can periodically mobilize them in the right way, I don't think the capitalist system is going to be remotely as responsive as we would want it, even if now the financial sector is beginning to switch on in a different way. But the financial people need the consumer interest there as well. So I haven't abandoned the idea of ordinary people acting as consumers. I do think they switch on in spikes, but if I could see a ready way of getting back into that space, I might well be tempted to try it. What's the word? I can't think. Something.
In the John Elkington
unreconstructed
of books to come. Yeah. I think I think consumers are better at being mobilized in the way that you were saying, to stop the things that they have come to the conclusion are bad, and they can see they're bad and they don't like them. And it is possible then through NGOs and amplifiers and all the rest of it to ensure that their strength then is effectively mobilized. But sustaining their commitment to do the good thing, the right thing, over a longer period of time, that is a much harder trick, and definitely one that I think brands have struggled with, to keep that consumer-based energy going. And I think are still struggling with that today, to be honest.
Well, I think the ones that were successful, insofar as you can be successful, were the early brands in that space, like Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia, who have succeeded long-term, Body Shop and so on. But in the end, none of them were really big enough. And so quite a number of those were bought out. And the one thing I would say is that I don't think it's an accident that big companies haven't been a success in driving some of that new thinking and these new lifestyles, because they have so much else that doesn't fit.
Yeah.
So as soon as they could sort of decelerate, throttle back, many of them gladly did so. Yeah.
So you mentioned the whole contribution to the broader role of capitalism in this sustainability movement, and still quite divergent views all over the place about the degree to which capitalism can be sufficiently transformed to enable it to deliver a sustainable future for humankind, however you want to define that.
Yeah.
Where, if I look at the decomposition that you've just flagged, is capitalism one of the victims of this decomposition, that the things become so bad that the capitalist construct itself, with all its key elements, is questioned to the point where it no longer exists in a recognizable form? Do you see it as bad, as big and bold as that, or slightly different?
It's interesting, Jonathan, you're sounding like Stalin, and perhaps let me explain why. You probably know the story, but I gave up economics at university first time around in 1968. And there were several reasons for that. One of us enumerate, which didn't help terribly, but there were several economists who really forcefully changed the way I thought. One was Nikolai Kondratiev, and the other was Joseph Schumpeter, both saying the same thing through cycles. And Stalin got, as you probably know, Kondratiev in to say, during the Depression, the Great Depression, that it's clear that capitalism is now flat in its face. Now is communism's time. And Kondratiev then replied, and it cost him his life, no, I don't think so, because this is what capitalism periodically does. It falls flat in its face, and then it goes through some sort of metamorphosis process and comes back stronger than ever. Now, nothing about that is guaranteed. But if I look at the sort of technological thinking, if I look at the sort of business models that are emerging, if I think of the values that are surfacing in the wider business world, there's some of the trends we've started to see in the financial world too. There's at least a strong chance now that we could actually rebuild capitalism in a very, very different configuration. But as I say, nothing guaranteed. But that's the potential that in what I do, what we do, we're trying to drive towards, but totally accepting we may be wrong.
I couldn't agree with you more. And genuinely, I think that the potential is there, but it's so problematic that this coincides with a period of time where the populism that you referred to and the burgeoning autocracy in many parts of the world, the questioning of the rule of law, as you said, the near implosion in US democracy, all of these forces are, cumulatively speaking, incredibly disturbing, and make it harder to see how a capitalist system could be reborn with a lot more of the benign characteristics that we're going to ask of it. I mean, the democracy bit now is almost more problematic to me than anything else.
I agree, and in some, let me go dark for a minute, and then we can go a bit brighter. But think, why did Bretton Woods in 1944 get us to the point where we could actually think really long term and create a system that, within its own terms, worked for so long? And the reason was people had been. It was an existential crisis. They'd been through World War, tens of millions of people killed. The thing that's really struck me from my reading, which may be erroneous, but of the economic history, is that when you go through these periods of an old order, economic order, declining, decomposing, whatever we call it, there's always a war in the midst of that. It's not always the same sort of war, but with both the world wars, you had some elements of that. I think we're much closer into a major exchange of some sort than we might like to think. And it may be China and Taiwan. It may be, there's so many other places in the world where something like that could suddenly ignite and do a sort of Balkans for us or whatever. And somebody once described wars as the human species or mankind thinking out loud, very loud. And at the end of a war, whether it's a civil war or religious war or whatever, often things are to some degree concluded. It may take a generation or five to sort of then work through. But I mean, you think about the US Civil War or our own, or whatever, a new order emerges from that. Now, I'm not prescribing warfare remotely, but just recently I've been working with the Carnegie Institute, the Ministry of Defense here, various other people on looking at the interactions, the interfaces between what we loosely call sustainability, the climate emergency, and all these other things, and security and defense. And one of the reasons I've been interested to do that, not just focus on business, is because my instinct again, my intuition again, is that we're moving towards something deeply, deeply unsettling and painful. I don't think well, who knows, but it's not going to be another world war. But with cyber hacking and with the, drones, we've got refineries being attacked, the potential for either proxy wars or deniable attacks or whatever is really going off the curve. And this is sort of dark side of the technological evolution curves are going up. So that's the dark piece. The question is, will people be able to, leaders be able to sense that and move fast enough to head it off? History suggests no, but I live rather stupidly perhaps, but in the belief that maybe we can actually do something here. But it goes back to the intergenerational contract, because if we can't persuade younger people that these are societies and economies and politics and so on that are worth investing their time and effort in, democracy is exactly as you say, will shrivel away because it doesn't deliver for some of its critical.
And one of the sort of most disturbing data sets to emerge from young people in the USA is how many of them have lost faith in democracy as a way of providing the security of a framework for the ways in which they might be able to prosper as individuals and communities. I mean, that's a very chilling consequence of the dysfunctionality in the American system. And in a way, America's kind of got to get its civil war sorted out before it can be party to this resurgence of more progressive ideas in the way capitalism is shaped. And that is one hell of a battle. I don't mean a civil war literally, but I do mean an institutional and political civil war of the kind that's going on at the moment.
I've called it an undeclared civil war, and I have family and friends right the way across the country, and it's going to get a lot worse, I think, before it gets any better, if indeed it does. But the odd thing, Jonathan, and you probably found the same thing, is now I'm really interested in the principle of the regenerative economy. So not just circular, but something that is regenerative across multiple dimensions. Paul Hawkins done his new book on all of that. And it's really striking when you look around the world for where a critical mass of regenerative experiments and so on are happening, and where some of the leading thinking on that sort of agenda is coming from. It's a bit like the 60s and 70s again. It's coming from America, and there's some extraordinary, there are extraordinary people here and elsewhere in Europe and so on. But in my experience, there's a disproportionate number of people in the US playing into this sort of space. And maybe there's a link there, I don't know. Maybe there's a separation out of the old order, which was fossil fuels and all the rest of it, really spooking the wits out of the people. Reality. And then something different starting to emerge, slightly out of sight, out of the limelight, but networked in very different ways. And there's a book, and I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was about a civil war that breaks out in science fiction novel, and it was about civil war in the United States, very convincingly written later in the century, but largely about fossil fuels and the southern states largely hanging on to them, and the rest of the country going in a different direction. So I don't think it's idle to describe it as a civil war. Something is at play there, which I think the current generation of politicians are really wrestling with.
Yeah, exactly. And Trump, in all his fully revealed horror, is just a manifestation of those tendencies, deep tendencies. So,
but he has instincts which he knows what's happening, and by God, he plays into feeding it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You mentioned the climate emergency there, John, and there is this sense that the climate emergency now hangs over so many other challenges that we're trying to
Yeah.
deal with, and may well cut short the amount of time that we have to manage those challenges just because of accelerating impact on our systems and lives, etc. How are you positioning now around the climate emergency in itself? I know you see it in a wider set of systems, but for you personally now, how are you facing up to code red at the moment?
Well, just very quickly, I don't like to say things without doing a reference. So the sci-fi novel I mentioned was called American War, perhaps obviously, but to climate change, I think I wrote a report in 1978 on climate change, and I visited the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution back in 2003, and I literally came out of Woods Hole with my knees knocking. I mean, the director took us, my wife and I, around for a pretty much full day for a whole series of presentations. And when they started to talk about the Greenland and Labrador pumps and the way in which the Gulf Stream might fail, which we're seeing, I mean, weakening for such a long time now, and what that would do to Northern Europe and so on, push us back towards Siberian conditions. I've been catatonic at some level ever since then, because I've been you can't be totally detached, but in a historic sense, I'm just looking at our capacity as a species to understand that sort of level of crisis and respond to it in a semi-intelligent way. And there's some part of me that lives in the hope that, Hemingway described one of his characters, the sun also rises, had this line, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was gradually, then suddenly. And the Silicon Valley folk talk about a gradually, then suddenly world. And I think we are in one of those. But the question is, does that take America completely off the rails? Does it take us completely off the rails? Or does it help to put us on a very, very different track? And I genuinely believe that if we can sort the intergenerational compact issue and we can engage with the new economy people, the people driving these new technologies and areas of science and business models and all the rest of it, in good time, we can have a quite disproportionate influence and radically greater than if we were just looking backwards and trying to deal with oil and coal. We've got to deal with that as well. But I mean, let's see the fossil fuels as a dying sector. So I don't know. I mean, I feel existentially challenged. I look at younger people and I see the extent to which they are increasingly suffering from eco-anxiety or whatever they choose to call it. But I remember the nuclear terror in the 50s and 60s, and my father was flying monitoring missions in Christmas Island around nuclear bombs. So even at 7 or 8, I had a sense of this imminence of a threat, but that still felt a long time. Well, Cuba crisis, a bit different for a few days, but I think the climate challenge is beginning to feel really imminent for people. I've got 2 friends in different parts of the world had their houses burned down, one in Australia, one in California. This is coming in.
Absolutely.
And Germany.
But have you constructed a series of defensive redoubts in a way to stop you fully absorbing just how far things have gone? I mean, there's a sort of story, and both you and I think, have been accosted with this suggestion on different occasions, that in a way, because our work is all about seeking out these solutions and synergies and ways forward and looking at the upside in whatever the situation is, because we're sort of so wedded to that actually, in a paradoxical way, we don't allow ourselves to be as open to that sort of the true depth of that grief and that fear of the future. Do you occasionally play with that possibility that you are protecting yourself in order to carry on doing the work that you do?
It's interesting, because that grief has been with me from actually a very early age. And at one point in the early 70s, My wife was not terribly keen on it, but I actually went and worked on a number of sort of dropout communities in the UK, in the United States, people experimenting with early forms of renewable energy technology and so on. And I concluded at that stage that that was not a model for the whole global population to follow. It was very quickly clear that there were human and cultural factors at work in those small communities, which meant that pretty much they all went down in flames. And so ever since then, and particularly in deciding to work with business from the 1970s, it's been an experiment, it's been exploration. And as you probably know, we've been in this odd space of being really challenging to our clients and refusing to work with lots of people. On occasion, don't like doing it, but resigning projects even when they're partway through. We haven't done that for a little while. But also picking clients or partner organizations to work with who are really trying to go into a transformative process. So Neste in Finland used to be the state-owned oil enterprise, now is trying to come out into sustainable aviation fuels, renewable energy, circular materials, although that still puts them in polymers. Acciona, very large Madrid-based but global renewable energy and infrastructure company, now embracing the idea of regeneration. So yes, at some point I'm privileged. I mean, I have a nice small home in London and all the rest of it, and feel relatively safe. But the insurers are starting to look at our house, which we moved to in 1975, and say that's an old floodplain. Well, we knew that, but that's going to flood in future scenarios. And so suddenly what we thought was an asset might become something of a liability. So these sorts of signals are pressing from all around. But actually, I think the worst thing that people like us could do, but maybe this is self-serving, you'll conclude, is to sort of take our hands off the wheel saying this isn't going to work, because then you get a very different set of political dynamics, and your concerns about democracy, at least in my mind, start to go off the curve, because people lose hope. They lose that sense that things could be.
Exactly.
That sense of progress, I think, has been so important in holding our societies together. And I genuinely still believe that if we can crack some of this stuff, progress defined in very different ways, it's back to these multiple capitals and all the rest of it, could be achievable. But I don't think we'll get there without having some pretty major reverses along the way.
I don't think I've ever heard you give in to what might be described as despair, John. I've often heard you sort of reflect a bit of sort of sardonic resignation and, oh God, this could be really bad. But I've never seen you, as it were, give voice to a form of existential despair, which would imply that it's too late.
Well, at some level, if I'm talking to people in particular businesses, it is too late. And I say so because we've left all sorts of things that we should have done much longer than we should have done, which means that they're going to be radically more expensive and challenging to deliver against. I mean, I don't terribly like to bear my soul, whatever that might be, in public. And I was born an optimist, which my darling wife would tend to say that I bounce back from things and I forget the bad stuff that happens along the way. And to some degree, if you're going to influence people, and particularly in top teams and business and financial world and so on, you can't go in there and do an existential howl. Even if that's, but I was watching we'd recorded one of the Earthshot Prize things. It was on Oceans last night. And I was in tears at a certain stage about sort of industrialized fishing and just the out of control nature of so much is what is happening. And the spirit of the piece is we can turn this around. Well, it's a huge thing to turn around, but at some level, and they gave the instance, you probably saw a bit of Liberia, where local citizens said enough is enough. And the government has pushed those big industrial holders further off their coast. So,
We've got to finish in a moment, John. I want to come back to for my last question. I want to come back to something you've referred to on a couple of occasions, which is the idea of a new intergenerational compact.
Yeah.
An idea, a big idea that I entirely subscribe to myself. But are there practical steps along the way to building a new intergenerational compact, or is it something that just hangs out there as a future beacon?
I think we should be working on it very actively, and I think we should be paying a lot more attention to it than perhaps we should. I mean, the ways that I've tried to engage, I mean, when Extinction Rebellion erupted, I did a certain amount to try and support that group of young activists. It became a little bit problematic at times, but nonetheless, I think they've had a useful influence overall. I don't think we can simply wait for the younger generation to reach out to older people and say, we want a compact. I mean, you've got to create a process where that compact is in play and you're inviting them into a process, but then them, who is that? And who are the young people who come into that sort of process? And the risk is they're from, if not high net worth families, they're certainly going to be people who've had an education and so on. So how do we do this such that it's really legitimate? And maybe it's an open source, crowdsource thing that is there and is iterated over a period of time, as long as it isn't completely captured. But so I'm prioritizing at the moment. Next week, for example, I'm doing something, I think, with Mishcon de Rea, the law firm, and they're pulling young people from around the world and talking about what is it like in the Democratic Republic of Congo? What is it like in Pakistan to be dealing with these sorts of issues? Do you have any agency? Do you have any sort of voice? And I think we need to do some of that exploratory work, but beyond that, we need to have a political process. And as you know, I've always been slightly gun shy of politics, whether it's got a capital P or a lowercase one. But now it is political. It's absolutely up to us. And don't give up, Jonathan. I mean, I know you're in no danger of doing so, but you said earlier on, you sort of been banging your head against a particular set of ceilings or walls for a very long time. It's an urban myth, but that thing about the monkeys and the cold shower and the bananas, where they finally accommodate and acclimatize themselves to an environment when nothing changes. I think we're right on the edge, the cusp of things potentially changing. But the question is, do they go our direction or somewhere else?
That has to be a very fitting note to end our formal interview on. Thank you, John. No, that's been terrific. And what a lovely chance just to catch up with you.
Same, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. And you know, as you were reflecting and going back to, you know, I'm saying things now that I perhaps wasn't articulate about or hadn't thought through earlier on. Absolutely true. I mean, I do think as we get a little bit older, you know, there are recognitions and awarenesses that sort of to our brains. So
absolutely.
But I think what you've done, I think what we've done, and very often I feel there are these moments, you know, think about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as a sort of form of competition there alongside this. It does work. The dynamic is helpful.
Yeah, no, I feel that very, very strongly. And still strongly resist people who think that there ought to be a sort of a convergence around
a Vatican. Let's have a Vatican.
Oh, for God's sake. You just think, really, now you're still arguing that? You still think that's the way of doing it? I mean, it's madness, but anyway.
Yeah, I agree. But immense thanks for this.
No, thank you. It's terrific.
Catch up a bit. Good luck with it all.
I'm sure that my colleagues will be in touch when they've worked out what to do with it.
Where's the incinerator?
John, thank you.
It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So much.
Thanks,
I think it's a wrap, as they say, Anna. So thanks a lot.
All right.